cars anymore, cell phones. And so maybe the optimal regulatory regime is going to change. And therefore, maybe sometimes we need to begin to regulate, but other times we need to deregulate a particular sector. And I think that's the way then economists think about policy. It's figuring out when there's a market failure, you regulate and you use the optimal regulation. And when there isn't a market failure, well, you deregulate or you restrain yourself from regulating that particular industry. And so the question that's really of interest, I think, as we now begin to approach the presidential campaign is this. Between 1975 and the present, we have experienced a broad period of deregulation. There have been some sectors of the economy where regulation has increased, but there are many sectors of the economy where regulation has decreased. And so the fundamental question is that deregulation that we have experienced optimal in the sense that it's merely reflecting changing economic conditions, and we've moved from a set of conditions where regulation used to be optimal, but it no longer is? Or have we deregulated there where perhaps regulation should continue? And that's really the central issue that I think in this particular area of public policy making may distinguish between the two presidential candidates, and maybe more broadly between the philosophies, or at least the dominant threads of the two different parties at the present moment. So what can we say then about some of the deregulation that has occurred? I suspect you're going to ask me some very specific and pointed questions about that, and I'm looking forward to those questions. I just want to say something to begin with, maybe to launch the discussion, which would be the following. Remember that I said at the very beginning that the presumption in the way most economists think about the world is that markets, if left to their own devices, will generate high levels of social welfare. They will generate good outcomes, all right? And therefore, they can afford to be, from a public policy perspective, we can afford to treat this large collection of markets generically as being the kind that really are benefiting from competition. And then there'll be these certain special cases where we want to regulate and not subject those to the default organizing method, which is competition. When it comes to competition, there are two very different schools of thought about the competition. Both schools of thought think the competition is good, but one school of thought is that if you leave the markets to their own devices, they will be competitive. In other words, laissez-faire will lead to competition. There's another group, a second view, which thinks that competition is good. They share that view with the first group, but they're more worried that if left to laissez-faire, that is, left to no government intervention, competition will not naturally thrive. It's sort of like, do you need a doctor in order to be well? In most situations, you don't need a doctor, laissez-faire. But there may be some situations where you need active intervention by a doctor to restore health. The people of view two think that those situations occur not infrequently, so you need a public policy to promote competition, and in the United States we call that policy antitrust policy, where antitrust policy is the use of law to promote competition. So both of these groups think competition is good, but one thinks it occurs naturally, and the other thinks that you need public policy to promote competition. Why is that relevant? It's relevant here when we think about deregulation, because if you're complete in your public policy formulation, and you believe that competition doesn't always occur totally naturally, then as you deregulate certain industries, you take them off the special sector list and you treat them just like every other industry, well then you better be subjecting them to antitrust policy and promoting competition in those industries rather than simply deregulating and leaving them entirely alone. Maybe I'll stop at this point and you can orient me then toward some of the issues that are uppermost in your mind.